Hi, everyone. Welcome to this edition of our Mindshift Cards Conversation, a part of our learning journey here at the Human School. Each week, we try to model some inquiry conversations around one of our Mindshift cards. And so tonight we have a question, and that question, sorry, I lost my place. That question is focused on storytelling. And so the question is, what are the benefits and drawbacks of using stories as evidence in serving society? So what are the benefits and drawbacks of using stories as evidence in serving society? So, Randy, you have some thoughts?
I'll throw one of each of those, a benefit and a drawback on the table, and we'll see if we can grab it like red meat and talk about it. So I think a benefit is, I don't know, I just had this image of throwing something on the table and like wolves going after it like red meat. So I think a benefit is that stories can inspire people to take action on something they may not have thought about previously. So quick example. So one thing I notice is that a lot of people that want to change school or like have that sort of gut feeling they want to change something about school, they oftentimes don't know what to change it to. They don't have examples. They don't see what the possibilities could be, and a story can inspire one to see what those possibilities are. I think a drawback to storytelling is we're required to be vulnerable if we're going to be a storyteller. And I also find that people are oftentimes uncomfortable with that. And I see a lot of educators that are doing a lot of really admirable, interesting things, and yet they don't want to tell that story because they don't want to stand out, or they don't want other people to possibly offer feedback or criticism. So they're uncomfortable with that vulnerability. So I'll throw those two ideas on the table and see what you guys think of those, or if you've got some other ideas.
So I will share with you today when I was engaged in a session where we were talking a lot about storytelling. And the challenge we put forth was not only for us to do a better job of telling our stories, but to encourage others and to create space. And a couple of us had this really rich conversation exactly about that, Randy, about what are the barriers for people telling their stories? And we talked about vulnerability. And what I said, what I thought was really important to talk about was that there are multiple root causes. So you identified a couple. I think another root cause is, kind of the idea that what I'm going to say doesn't provide much value. I think a lot of times educators, they feel like the thing that they want to share, someone's already done, or it's not that impressive in their own mind. And I can certainly say that that's probably my biggest root cause for not wanting to share my stories, is because I oftentimes don't know how much value they provide. What I'll say kind of in response to that, though, is it's because we always, and I think a lot about, Margaret Wheatley's work and Walk Out and Walk On, and the idea that, we always want to scale. Stories are deeply personal and contextual. And one of the things that has allowed me to do a better job of telling my story is that I don't have to tell it because I expect other people to follow it or to use it. It is deeply and uniquely inherently mine. And if people see value in it or don't see value in it, that's up to them as an audience. That doesn't mean I'm not responsible to share that. Like, it doesn't mean that I'm not responsible to tell it in a compelling way or a way that connects, but I stopped feeling like I owed somebody something through that story because it was an opportunity for me to share from my own context. So I know that doesn't answer your question to move us forward, but I do think that that's such an interesting question as to what it is that gets in the way and how that's personal for every person.
Yeah, and I think vulnerability is personal too.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think the vulnerability thing too is, I think, often a fear that we're alone in our experience, that it's not just that other people aren't going to value it, but also that it's just me. It's just other people don't experience it. Other people aren't going to understand, and that will be somehow ridiculous or less than because that's not other people's experience. And often I find the opposite is true, right? The things that we're afraid of. I was in a session a couple of weeks ago, and we did a great opening activity where everybody got these cards and you had questions, and they were ranging from sort of like just really surface sweet to kind of a little bit deeper, but not over the top. And then every time you asked a question and traded answers, you would trade the cards, right? So one of them was one of the guys that I was talking to in the group is incredibly gregarious, has this big personality, has like a television show and is a teacher and something else. So you would think that he's pretty confident. But the question that we got was something around, what was something that surprised you about the experience? And one of the things that he said was he was really relieved to find other people feel like imposters. And I remember thinking, like, you feel like an imposter? You're on TV. You're like very gregarious and personable, and like, oh, okay. And it's funny that my feeling was just the same as his, like, oh, other people feel like this. It's not just me. And so I think that the power of sharing them and those vulnerabilities is that often we find that we're not alone in the things that we're thinking about or the experiences that we have.
And when I think about one of our first mind shifts, it's about curiosity, but going from passive to active. And I oftentimes think, like what you just shared, Rachel, was this idea that we go from, can you find the courage and bravery to be vulnerable? And that oftentimes when you're the person asking the question as an objector or the first person to share the story, it invites others into that space as well. And so bravery, I think a big part of this storytelling as well.
Yeah. What about drawbacks?
I mean, I think one that's imposed upon us is the need and the necessity for numbers. I think that people, even when you tell a story, it's like, well, show me the data, right? People don't see stories as evidence. They oftentimes, if you can't quantify it, it doesn't matter. We're in a quantitative world. And so I think that the drawback is if you come with stories and you don't have data or evidence to support it, and which is why we intentionally have said it's stories and numbers, not just stories alone. Numbers can strengthen it. I think in my worldview, when you just present numbers without story, it's not nearly as compelling, as the reverse. So I think a major problem is that our society is built around numbers.
So one of the connections that I make to this conversation, I always go back to the idea of leadership and how do leaders sort of create the space to create the culture that storytelling is something that we do. And the opposite of that would be how are leaders not creating the space and creating the culture that says that storytelling isn't something that we do. And I think that probably happens not out of intentionality, but just because stories aren't all that valued, as you had mentioned earlier. But, I oftentimes do think about, like, how do we start to create those conditions so that storytelling is the norm? And one way is to just have conversations like this too, which require vulnerability and require openness. But, I think connection, conversation, building a relationship is always the foundation in which we begin to solve these problems.
So I'll share again today. I had an opportunity to facilitate a meeting of about 45, 50 leaders. And the first part of it was focused on storytelling. And it was really wonderful to see as people stood and just shared a story. So we challenged everybody to come with a story of a way that they saw someone in their stead, their service, who served the mission and vision of the organization. And it was a vibrant environment. Like, we gave people a focus, and then the conversation that followed, to your point, Randy, was how can we create space, make time, be intentional about that commitment? Like, there's so many things we do. Why can't storytelling be one of those ways in which we transmit our culture? And it was great conversation.
The example that you're giving there too, I wasn't there obviously, but it sounds like the storytelling was a medium in which to create connection amongst the group too, to really start to peel back all the noise of the day and see the humanity of the people that are involved in this work. And we show that humanity through the stories that we tell.
And what was wonderful was the way that everybody came to the conversation and the way they interpreted the question and shared. And some people shared incredibly personal, human, vulnerable things. Other people shared surface, transactional, but really important stories for the organization. So again, the connection I keep making with the leadership part of creating space is just to value it and then do it. There's no like protocol. You don't have to. It's what's the story that we're going to tell today? And I think the other challenge is we're so busy doing, we're so busy transacting that in a one-on-one conversation that I might have with a teacher or a one-on-one conversation I have with a colleague, how can I start by telling a story and then asking them to return that? It creates a space then for deeper conversation. But we have to do that intentionally. Go ahead, Rachel.
Yeah. No, I that's what I was going to say. I think one of the drawbacks can be it's great that we want to tell our stories, but I think the other piece of that is creating space for other people. And like Randy talked about, creating the conditions for other people, because I think oftentimes once we get comfortable storytelling, that's wonderful. But I think sometimes I'm definitely one of these people that I have to make sure that I create space and time to let other people talk, because it shouldn't be me telling my story to tell it. It should be to create conditions for other people to feel comfortable and then genuinely listen to what the other person has to say. So I really like that you had, it sounded like you had people telling stories about others. So it created, as opposed to me telling you about me, it created some space for people to hear about one another and then listen, but then also hopefully encourage them to talk about each other and then to create space to talk for other people to speak.
One of the other things I think that was really kind of an aha moment for me today, though, was that people are storytellers in their personal lives. So we always talk about how, you get together with your friends, you go out, you have a couple drinks, you tell stories. It's not a thing that people think about. It's just what you do. When the three of us get together and we hang out, we tell stories all day long. We're texting and telling stories. Yeah. But somehow in the professional world, it's this thing that you just don't do. And it feels, to Randy's point, like to be human is we make sense of, you all know Harari. He's got that great quote, humans tell stories to make sense of the world. And yet somehow in our professional lives, we seem like we don't have time for that. It might be the most important thing that we can do to transmit culture and beliefs and values.
Yeah.
Does that go back to your data comment? Is it because we're sort of living in this world where it's not considered worthy, it's not considered of any value because there's other stuff that has more value? So and wondering.
Yeah, no. And my direct response to that immediately is thinking about how as a classroom teacher, when we were standards based and we weren't grading, with numbers, how I felt that going gradeless was amongst the most, aside from being an incredibly professional thing, it trusted me as an educator to know my learners. I didn't have to justify it with a percentage or a number that I could collect a lot of different evidence. And I would say that one of the things I would hope, my aspirational hope for us in our work with the Human School would be for people, we can't avoid numbers. I'm not suggesting that we just completely eliminate them. They do provide some value. But how do we get to a place where we trust and we're willing to listen to the stories? Because as Randy started this conversation, the story is where the power is. The story is memorable. The data is forgettable. You go in front of a board and you present a bunch of numbers. Nobody remembers them after they leave. But you tell a powerful story, people will remember that. And yet somehow we don't acknowledge the value in that, which is sad.
Yeah.
Good stuff.
Well, we'd just like to thank all of you for joining us tonight for our conversation around storytelling. And we hope that as your mind begins to shift, that you'll share your thoughts with us about this question and many other questions at thehuman.school. As always, thanks for the conversation, guys.
Bye-bye.
Bye.